Isaac Ben-Ezra, host and co-producer of Conversations. Carol,
Yes.
before I even introduce you, I just want to welcome you back from Egypt.
Thank you.
I'm glad you got here without getting arrested. That was our concern.
Me too.
But I understand things got quite hot after a while. Carol Gray is a trustee, library trustee member, and has been serving the community for a long time at town meeting as well. And she started last year by getting a scholarship, which we're going to talk about, which got her and her family to Egypt before the revolution. So, Carol, bring us up to date on what that scholarship was all about.
Sure.
And what your plans were when you got there.
Sure. Thanks, Isaac. So I applied for and received a scholarship from Rotary International. It's called the Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholarship. I went with my family. I think we were one of maybe the only family group of scholars to go. It was my husband, Jeff Lee, and my son, Cameron Gray Lee, and he was 6 when we left. And we left in August of 2010. It was an academic year scholarship, and as part of the scholarship, I was enrolling with the American University in Cairo as a graduate student for 1 year in their International Human Rights Law program. And so that's what I went to do in August. And I finished the whole program. I should say I'm no longer a scholar with Rotary International because during the revolution, they had recommended that we leave, and our family chose to stay. So we relinquished that scholarship to remain in Cairo during the revolution.
And I understand you found an apartment and you
Yes.
lived in a community. And
We did.
how were you received by your neighbors?
Wonderfully. Egyptians are perhaps the most hospitable group of people I've ever met as a community. They love to have foreigners, and us Americans especially, come and visit and to share their culture. And we lived in an area called Mahdi, which is about a 30-minute metro ride to Tahrir Square. My school, American University in Cairo, was actually about 200 yards from Tahrir Square. So I was in that area several times a week for school anyway, so I knew that area quite well. But we lived in the suburbs of Cairo, and my husband, who's a computer technology person, was doing all his work back in Massachusetts through Skype. So, and my son went to kindergarten at the Irish International School in Mahdi, which is part of Cairo.
How did he adjust to it?
Oh, he loved it. He thought it was wonderful, and his classmates were from Azerbaijan and Libya and Paraguay, and many of them spoke multiple languages, and he just soaked up all this interesting culture like a sponge.
So there you are doing your academic stuff, which preceded the revolution by 4 months. And then things start to break out. Tell us about it.
So, of course, Tunisia happened first, and I remember my family and I attended a church in our neighborhood, and the minister gave a sermon about what happened in Tunisia, and he said, some of you may be concerned that this might happen here. And I had talked to a friend of mine in the congregation before, and we said, well, we hadn't actually thought of that at the time, but now that he mentions it, I wonder if it will happen here. But in earnest, we didn't think it would happen in Egypt, because Egypt was a very controlled place. People did not talk about politics in the street, and it seemed like what happened in Tunisia could not happen in Egypt, at least to people who were new to the culture. I later found out that there was a whole movement long before the revolution started that laid the foundation.
Long before you got there, so any coincidence has nothing to do with your political fervor.
The revolution, no, I had no.
Good.
I was no instigator of the revolution.
There she goes again.
Well, some of my friends said that back home, but no, I take no credit for the revolution.
I
That was
know.
purely Egyptian. At any rate, so the revolution started on January 25th, which ironically was called Police Day, and it was a holiday. And it was also during the academic break. So I think that was actually critical, because students and young people were a very large part of the revolution. So that they were on break and had time to organize helped there be more people in the streets. Anyway, so Police Day was a Tuesday, and it was a holiday, so there was a big protest planned. And my husband and son and I were in Alexandria doing talks for Rotary International. I had 4 talks planned in Alexandria for those 2 days, and I get a call from my husband saying, the protest just went by our hotel. I said, oh, let's go take some pictures. So I said, where's it headed? So we went to where the protest was going, and I took pictures, and I filmed with my video camera. And little did I know that was the start of the revolution. There were protests in Alexandria and in Cairo and in other parts of Egypt on Police Day. And I still went and did my Rotary talks, and I remember one Rotarian there saying, the real test is going to be whether these protests continue. If it's just today, then it's not the start of anything. But if they continue, if by Friday there's still more protests, then this will be something different. And sure enough, that Friday, which is the first day of the weekend in Egypt, that Friday after morning prayers, Muslim prayers finished about 12:30, there was a massive protest in Tahrir Square. That was the day that they also cut the internet. The internet was completely blacked out for 5 days in Cairo. Shall I tell you more about that?
Why not?
Okay, so
you were there.
I was there.
We're waiting to hear.
Yeah, so we were back in Cairo by the time the 28th comes, and the 28th of January was called the Day of Rage, in that there was a massive protest scheduled, and it was a protest against the continued lack of democracy. They wanted President Mubarak, who was then in power almost 30 years, to resign. Because he hadn't been democratically elected. Elections had been rigged for many years. So this protest was held, and there was a lot of lead up to this, and people were worried. But they called for 1 million people to turn out. I believe that was, or actually the 1 million person one was the following Tuesday, but they called for a big protest. So I tried to get to the square, but even before I left in the morning, I noticed when I was online around 1 or 2 in the morning the night before that something funny was happening with YouTube. Any YouTube videos about protests in Egypt weren't playing. They were just streaming music and no video. And I thought, that's odd. And then that morning, I'm talking to a friend of mine at around 9 in the morning, and she lived near the square. And I said, Diana, I'd like to come to your house if I can't get to the square or if things get hairy. I need a place to go. And in the middle of my conversation with her, the phone cuts off. And we're like, hello, hello, and no communication. I didn't know at the time that everything had been cut in the whole country. Internet, phones, everything. Except, ironically, landlines. So people who had landlines, who never used them because everyone's into cell phones, started realizing, wait a second, the landlines work. What was our number again? let's find out what our landline number is. And so even when all the internet was cut, I was still able people were calling in from the US to see if we were still okay. And I even talked to Scott Mertzbach from the Bulletin, and he interviewed me on the landline when the internet was completely blacked out. Anyway, that was for the Bulletin article that they did. A friend of Jeff's was into media, so he had gotten them on the line to interview me. So the Day of Rage, I head into the square, but the metro won't go all the way to the square because they've shut down all the metro stations right in the heart of the square. So I had to get off a couple stops beforehand. And when I get off, there's a very heavy police presence. And I'm trying to walk towards the square, but there are police in riot gear everywhere. And I walk down one street and I see it lined with all these enormous trucks, like lorries, like Mack truck size, that are carriers for police personnel. They carry about, 60 to 80 people packed in these trucks. And this one street is lined with all these personnel carriers. And I just nodded to people and just kept walking. And I dressed like this, and I was going to tell them I'm just going to the university because the university was right in the square practically. And I was dressed like a faculty member, and I look American, so I thought, I think I can make it to the square. So I saw all these riot police lined up, blocking the intersections to lead to the square. But I just nodded to them and wished them, good afternoon in Arabic, and I walked right by. And so I was able to get all the way to the square. And the street that my college was on, the university was on, was lined with these personnel carriers, like 10 or 20 of them. Just the entire street was full. This, I thought at first there was a group of people in plain clothes, and I thought those were protesters, about 100 or 150. Turned out they were all plainclothes police officers. So the protesters hadn't been able to get to the square yet. So I stood in this doorway with this kind of, that led to this corridor with a couple of stores in the back, and then there was a stairway that led up to apartments. And there were about 5 or 6 Egyptians there. So I just hung out with these Egyptians, and we just watched and waited. And as we were watching and waiting, we could hear, we would see groups of police all of a sudden run in one direction. Now the square has streets that feed into it from all different parts of the city. So there's about 5 or 6 main thoroughfares that you can get to the square with. So we'd see about a couple hundred police taking off in one direction. And then everything would be quiet for a little while more, and we'd see another few hundred taking off in a different direction. So we thought, okay, the protesters are coming from all these different points. Meanwhile, we just waited, and other things that were happening there, this one Asian woman came, and she was going upstairs, and I also went upstairs because I was trying to figure out if there's a window that I could take pictures from without being noticed, just for safety purposes. And I met her in the stairway, and I said, "Are you a reporter?" And she said, "Who are you?" And because at that point it wasn't really safe to be a reporter. And I said, "Well, I'm a graduate student studying human rights." And she said, "Okay, I'm a reporter." And then I said, "I wanted to go shoot from a window or an apartment. Do you know if there's anything?" And she said, "There's a guy on the 3rd floor who says we can go in his apartment if things get really hairy." I said, "Okay, great." So I go up and I ask him, I said, "Could I come in here too if things get violent?" And he says, "Okay, but only if things get really bad." I said, "Okay, great." So anyway, and then I found out from that journalist woman that people were getting their cameras taken. And she said, "We already had someone get a camera taken." And she said, "I heard about another journalist who had their camera get thrown on the ground and smashed." And I had a little camera. It was not much bigger than my cell phone. And I just rolled it up in a newspaper. And I would go out of this little doorway and just keep the camera at waist and just lift it and go click, 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 and then put it back in the newspaper.
Did you see any of the police violence?
So after we were in the square for a while, short answer is yes, I saw the tear gas, I saw people running from tear gas, and I saw people who'd been shot with rubber bullets. The way that I got to see that was after being in the square for some time, one of the Egyptians there said he was going to be going to try to find the protesters, because at one point we could hear them chanting, and we thought they're going to come, and then it was quiet. They'd been silenced. So we went in that direction. He invited anyone in the doorway to come with him. I said, "Oh, I'll go." So we walked together, and we found a group of protesters headed towards the square. And I was trying to stay on the outskirts of the protest because I'd promised my husband I wouldn't get in the middle of things. But then all of a sudden, these tank-like vehicles, but they moved faster than tanks, they started coming towards the protesters and shooting tear gas. So everyone started to run. So even though I was at the back of the protest, I became at the front of the protest with everyone running towards us, and these tank-like vehicles shooting tear gas at everyone. So we start running with everyone else, and we would run into the Arabic person I was with would talk to the person guarding different buildings and persuade them to let us in. So we'd escape from the tear gas and run into a building. And then when things settled down, we'd come back out again, and the same thing would replay again and again. We'd try to go down one street, and we'd find a group of protesters, and then they'd be shooting tear gas. And at one point, I remember the tear gas was so thick. We were hiding in this one vestibule, and we could just hear the toom, 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 like 20 rounds of tear gas just kept coming. And some guy who had been shot was dragged into the vestibule, but he later disappeared, so I guess maybe he wasn't too badly hurt, or they carried him away. And these women who were running from the tear gas came in, these young people, young men and women, they would come in and just be coughing and coughing and eyes burning. The tear gas was really painful. I'd never experienced tear gas before, and it was very painful on the throat and on the eyes. they would just catch their breath for like 5 minutes and they go right back out. And I'd try to go back out and these clouds of tear gas would have me overwhelmed in a minute or two and I'd want to retreat. And these Egyptians just kept plowing into these clouds of tear gas towards these tanks and just kept pushing and pushing to get towards the square. And eventually they got to the square. By that night they were in the square and they held it for 18 days until Mubarak resigned.
At this point, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier before we got on air about the 50 to 100 interviews that you did,
Yeah.
which was your major assignment and the purpose of being there. You were studying human rights in Egypt, and you got a mouthful and an eyeful.
I did. This actually became my major project, but it came out of the revolution. During the revolution, I was going to the square periodically, like every few days. Whenever they'd say they wanted a million person march, I'd say, okay, I'm going to go. They need 1 million, I'm one, I'll go. But when I'd go to the square, I'd try to make friends with some Egyptian on the metro so I wouldn't be alone, because I just spoke a little bit of Arabic, and it was safer to have a friend. So one day going to the square, I met these 3 women I'd look on the metro to see, who looks like they're going to a protest. And I went to these 3 women. I said, excuse me, do you speak English? Yes, they did. Are you going to this tourist square? They said, yes, we're political activists. Are you? And I thought, wow, what luck. These women are self-identifying as political activists in a climate where people didn't talk about politics. So I said, well, here I'm more observing and I have a blog. Could I interview you for my blog? And they said, well, we're going to the office where all the social activists organize and convene. Would you like to come with us? And you could interview someone there. I said, great. So they took me to this office.
Boy, how naive they were.
Well, they were wonderful. And it was wonderful luck for me. So I went to this office, which later I learned worked in conjunction with a law office, one floor above. And I ended up later applying for a research grant to do an oral history of the law office. I'm a lawyer as my background, so their role in the revolution was really fascinating to me. And when I got to this office, I saw that, in fact, this really was this was like a control center for the revolution. And they were collecting funds and blankets for the revolution, hundreds of blankets and medical supplies. And I've interviewed a doctor who says, we're treating people here, but we're running out of medication, and we really need donations for medication. And the activists would go there to sleep or to bathe, and when they were shot. So this was really, and the law office was where the Front to Defend Egyptian Protesters was housed. And this was an organization that was founded a couple years before the revolution to help protect and train protesters, train them about what to do when you're arrested, train them about how to withstand torture, because torture was very common with anyone who was arrested if you're Egyptian. And this office, it's just amazing, the work they do for human rights. And I saw during the revolution, on February 3rd, during the middle of the revolution, that office was raided. 37 people were arrested from that office, and the laptops, the hard drives were all taken, laptops were taken by the military people, and the office was completely trashed. Anyway, so after the revolution, I'd seen all this on Al Jazeera about how this office was raided. So I thought they must be doing excellent work. And after the revolution, I went and I said, hello, I'm a lawyer. I'd like to volunteer. I saw what happened to you during the revolution, and I think you must be doing some of the most important work. How could I help? And as I was volunteering there, I was working on doing research to look at other constitutions to see what provisions might be applicable for their new constitution. But then I realized what I'd really like to do is help document what's happened. So I asked them, do you have a written history? And they said, no. I said, I could interview everyone and write it for you. Would you like me to do that? They said, okay. And then I found out that the university I was at had grants for $3,000 to document the revolution. So I applied for a grant to document this organization's role in the revolution, and I got it. And I interviewed more than 50 people and have more than 100 hours of tapes of interviews. And now I'm working on transcribing those, and we'll be writing a history of the organization. The organization will take some of the videos and do a documentary history for their website.
We're going to come back at another time, but I want to get to the piece about, meanwhile, you got a husband and a
Yes.
6-year-old.
Right.
What was happening to them?
Well, they withstood the revolution marvelously. And, my son, he managed just fine. I remember at one point when all the police disappeared from the streets, the president thought he would teach Egyptians that they really preferred the dictatorship because it promoted stability. And he thought the way to teach them is remove all the police from the streets for several days. So looters were going around in some neighborhoods. So each neighborhood put together their own little group that would stay up all night outside the buildings and keep watch over the whole neighborhood. Anyway, during this time, my son Cameron said, Mommy, if people come to our door, I've made an obstacle course for them to trip over. So I put, he had peeled banana peels all around and pieces of cardboard all around. And meanwhile, we were barricading the door with this big heavy wooden chairs because we felt safer that way. But so we had all these banana peels. And I said, well, Cameron, that's a nice idea, but if we trip on the banana peels, there aren't any ambulances that can get us to the hospital, so we can't get hurt, so no banana peels. But anyway, but so he in his child way, coped.
And he was at school.
He was in kindergarten. Well, the schools,
about
everything shut down during the revolution. Yes, everything was shut down. But it resumed not too long after the revolution. And my husband, he wanted to stay as well. At one point in the middle of the revolution, a friend of mine called me on the speed dial that I was on her phone, and the police answered my cell phone. And she thought they'd arrested me because a lot of foreigners were getting arrested then. Not even being in the square, just being rounded up. And the police answered, and they said, "This is the police." And she ran out to the street to get someone to translate for her in Arabic. And they said, "No, we don't have Carol, but we do have her phone." And meanwhile, I had my phone with me all day long. So they didn't have the physical phone, but they wanted, I think, me to know that they had my phone.
They were watching.
They were watching. And I knew they were watching from the first week I got there, because when I was blogging, I have a blog, it's called rotaryincairo.blogspot.com. So if anyone wants to read about what was happening, it's still posted. You can go look. Anyway, the first week I logged into my blog in Cairo, a black band appeared on the edge of it with an Arabic word, and I cut and pasted that into translation, and it said observation. So I knew that I was being watched. At any rate, and then I especially knew it when I got back, and I had hired a translator, a young woman who was a recent graduate student, who was going to transcribe all my interviews in Cairo. The rates are much cheaper there, so I could use my grant money and get almost everything transcribed. But I got an email from her shortly after we'd returned in June of last year, saying that she was getting phone calls from the security forces. Apparently her aunt's husband was a deputy in the security forces, which in the Ministry of the Interior, which is pretty high up. And he had been calling her saying that they knew that she met with me in Cairo on this date, met with me in Alexandria on this date. They knew that she and I went together to the Human Rights Office on this date, and that everyone in that office was on a list, that I was on a list, and now she was on a list, and she had to stop working for me. So she tried to hang in there for a little while, but then ultimately I got an email from her saying, "They're arresting everyone who's translating for Americans. I can't help you anymore." Anyway, so then that delayed the project somewhat, and I'm still working on getting the tapes transcribed. But and that fit with also when I was in Alexandria, I had been doing interviews for about 9 hours straight in a hotel that we were at, and then I put my laptop in our bedroom, and my husband, son, and I went out for dinner. When I came back, the back of the laptop had been screwed on very hastily, such that the plastic part that's supposed to go inside was hanging out, and the computer wobbled. So someone had been in there and messed with the computer in the hour that we were gone. And I pointed out to my husband, and I don't know that he really took it seriously, but I said, "No, I've been using it all day long. The computer did not wobble all day long." But then once the translator who was with me that day said that she'd been told that they knew that I was doing interviews in Alexandria with her that day, I think. Anyway, so I think that there's a heavy police presence. And this was all after the revolution, by the way, I should say.
Well, the revolution is not over. As a matter of fact, I think part B, which we'll get into at another time, has to do with the reality that the revolution was basically taken over by the military, and so we don't have a revolution yet. It looks like we're ready for another revolution.
Yeah, it was really, from the start, I thought this is going to be a two-part revolution.
Yeah.
And it was interesting and curious to me that in the square, when the military started coming to the square, the Egyptians hailed them as the saviors.
They thought they were on
thought.
their side. And I have to break in now, but
Yes.
we're going to have you back.
Okay.
Carol, it's fascinating, and we've got to do another show.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you so much.
So, folks, you can watch this on Channel 12, probably starting on Wednesday night at 7. Check our schedule for the other 5 times. I want to thank the student volunteers and the staff for making this possible. See you next week. Good night.